ground, covering terminology like Project Eworth and Tuscaloosa County Community Corrections. Then we'll talk about how we collected data for our study. Then we'll talk about analysis development and the outcomes of our research, and finally, future research directions. So to begin, the basis for our project is called Project Eworth, which is an intervention educational module that was developed for Black women in community corrections, largely based out of Columbia University. WORTH stands for Women on the Road to Health, and essentially it is an online deployable app that can also be downloaded to be used offline that goes through HIV and STD prevention steps, a lot of which are interactive and interpersonally story-based, as you can see in the center with these reflections that people who complete the module are asked to do. What different analyses concluded about interventions like Project Eworth is that there remains an urgent public health need to scale up culturally tailored interventions to redress the concentrated HIV-STI epidemics among Black justice-involved women that continue to be driven by structural racism. So we know that Black women, particularly in community corrections, are disproportionately affected by these issues, and cultural tailoring is one of the ways that we can make interventions more effective. Project Eworth and the work that we're doing is the only effort in the nation on the front of regional cultural adaptation, which leads into the work that I'm doing on this project. So when I started on this project, the first on-the-ground work that I did was going to the Tuscaloosa County Alternative Sentencing Office, which works with Tuscaloosa County Community Corrections. There, I helped administer Qualtrics surveys to women who were involved in the community correction system and essentially asked them about distrust of providers in their lives, whether that be medical, whether that be religious, or other categories of help in their life, along with their risk factors and life experiences. This was to build on a body of previous work that identified Black women in the South particular issues in the Eworth modules that it didn't address distrust between these women and the providers in their lives. So I started with these Qualtrics surveys, and then we worked with 2 sets of interviews. So we have initial one-on-one interviews, 27 from New York and 16 from Alabama. And then at the Alternative Sentencing Office, this is part of the Qualtrics form that I deployed that we are still finishing our collections on. So we have a complete set of interviews and one that we are wrapping up and going to begin analysis on in the future. So after I helped deploy the Qualtrics form, I started working with those 27 and 16 interviews from New York and Alabama respectively. First, we put those interview transcripts into an LLM called BurTopic. BurTopic essentially addresses different human interactions, in this case transcripts, text-based, creates vectors where it assigns values to different words relative to their context to one another, and then clusters them based on topics. So for example, key, lock, and door might all get put together along with their surrounding sentence context. So once the initial transcripts had gone through BurTopic, we also deployed ChatGPT, which I think many people are much more familiar with. We used the 4.0 mini module and essentially said, okay, given these overall topics that BurTopic identified from these interviews, can you parse out where there were unique things in New York or unique things in Alabama and where there was thematic overlap? So we parsed out the filler words like yeah, random numbers, and then I built a Python script that essentially called the ChatGPT API to go through the names of the topics. So it would say, this cluster, we're going to call it this more human label. And then it also analyzed the keywords that BurTopic put together and made a matrix. So earlier I mentioned that BurTopic assigned values to different topics in the transcripts it analyzed. ChatGPT is doing a similar secondary thing here, where it essentially says, all right, this is what BurTopic put together. Now, with one cluster to another, we'll assign them values and see how similar they are between the different states. So we passed the whole clusters from BurTopic and then the names that ChatGPT gave these different clusters into R to visualize some of those similarities and differences that both of the AI models identified. And we also passed the names that ChatGPT gave the clusters and the values from the matrix into Python to visualize what it considered the most distinct topics. So first, I'll start by talking about keywords that appeared in both states. Using R, we did statistical analysis of keywords that appeared over twice between both states and compared it in a Poisson test, which essentially asks, okay, based on the number of interviews we have from each state, here's how many times we would expect, for example, the keyword think to appear in New York versus Alabama. So every place on this graph that you see dots off the center of those two bars, the blue and red, is a place that the keyword usage differed from predicted ratios if everything was random and these two cultural pockets displayed the exact same trends in their interviews. When we break that down to the statistical analysis of the overall keyword use, we see a rate ratio of 0.601, and if it was completely random, we would see a ratio of 1. The confidence interval confirms that this is pretty much in the correct range to have a very statistically significant p-value, meaning there are differences between these interview transcripts that are not random and support our idea that there are cultural differences that need to be addressed in adapting these interventions. Once we put this material through Python to visualize that matrix, we also see, using the names that ChatGPT gave the topic clusters, that there in each state are at least 7 completely unique topic clusters that topic generated. So as you can see on the one hand in our red box for New York, for example, duration and time variability really only came up in New York, whereas jail reform and rehabilitation program perspectives only came up in Alabama. So moving forward with this, we have our analysis of the initial interviews as well as community data from group interviews that says, okay, distrust is something that we need to look at. It's a cultural difference. We've quantified that using topic and ChatGPT through statistical analysis. Now we have this set of interviews that I mentioned deploying at the beginning of this presentation with the Alternative Sentencing Office. So our goals are continued analysis of the qualitative data using these additional interviews we're collecting from women who are actively involved in community corrections. Our goal was to identify trusted providers or lack thereof. Shockingly, after over 100 interviews of women surveyed, there were very few trusted providers that anybody even listed, which supports our idea that using these AI tools like topic and ChatGPT, as well as visualizations through R and Python, and modulating with ethical concerns about how to use these things best, we can further use this data to modify Project eWorth to be Project eWorth South, a process that's already ongoing. The idea is that as we continue to analyze this data, we will be able to add to Project eWorth South and address distrust so that women who undergo this intervention are able to address that kind of culturally unique element in their educational practices. So overall, we've taken these interviews, we're analyzing them and trying to understand how to adapt them to the place and time we are in the Deep South. I would love to take any questions. You'll also see that the Project eWorth promotional website is on a QR code there if you're curious about access to the resources.
Yeah, so I was wondering, what impact do you think an interview population from the Alternative Sentencing Office had on unique issues that came up?
So I had not heard of the Alternative Sentencing Office before I began this project, and I think it's notable that there were so few trusted providers identified in that group because a lot of times it is women undergoing non-traditional community corrections procedures. So the fact that even though they are working with a program that we might tend to think of as more personable, they still have a massive lack of distrust. I think it indicates even more strongly that that's something that needs to be bridged and addressed in interventions like eWorth.
How did you decide what filler was excluded from the AI analysis?
So that's a great question. We first wanted true filler words to be out of the way. So if somebody said, yeah, like, actually, those we tossed kind of from the get-go. But then we ran everything without excluding the filler words, and essentially I and the grad students and Dr. Johnson went through and identified keywords that topic had pulled that were nonsense or didn't make sense with any of the context that it was giving back to us. So, for example, I took out 21 and I combined month and months so that the data would be more readable and easier to visualize in R and using Python to call ChatGPT.
What is the advantage of using topic for grouping over purely statistical analysis in a software like R?
Gotcha. So the question would be, is it worth it to use an LLM, or should we just try and go through and count how many appearances there are of, say, rehab as a term? The advantage of using an LLM like topic, which I am still working on getting familiar with, this is my first time really working directly with an LLM, is that it identifies these keywords in their context, and that's part of the AI element of this project. So instead of just saying rehab, when rehab might sometimes occur 2 words away from the word reform, sometimes a sentence away, but be circled around a similar topic, topic does a much better job of identifying these topic ideas and grouping that data instead of just counting word occurrences.